Hello, everybody. It is my pleasure to have all of you join us in another of our Talk With series. And today it is Talk with Steve Braude with the subject of active analysis of precognition, a very different precog model. So I think we're all looking forward to seeing what that is. Steve is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and former chair of the department at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He pays a lot of attention to discussing the inadequacy of mechanistic theories in psychology and cognitive science. He just does an enormous amount of thinking in the whole field of psi. And so he would be a logical one to come up with a very different precog model. He's got many, many articles out there. Here is a selection of a few on the meaning of the paranormal, psi and our picture of the world, paranormal phenomena in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the problem of super psi, and I think these are all the books he has out, but notice he's got 6 of them. One of his favorite subjects is psychokinesis in various forms. But as a philosopher, he just talks about lots of different things, including this immortal remains. And then I think today we're going to be getting into a little bit about the limits of influence. So with that, let's turn this over to Steve. And so I'll stop my share. And then you should have that green folder on the bottom.
Got it. I'm clicking on it.
Okay, it just takes minutes sometimes.
I have the patience of an oyster.
Well, try it again. Double click. I have the patience of an oyster. There you go. Okay, precognition. So we're seeing your screen.
I'm trying to, there we go. All right, everybody. You with me, Marty?
Yep, we're with you. And let's go. We can see you and we can see your presentation.
All right, let's get into it. I think for present purposes, I think we can agree to rule out explanations in terms of normal or abnormal processes, that is, non-paranormal explanations like mere coincidences or ordinary inferences. What we're concerned with here is how do you explain precognition assuming you've got to appeal to something paranormal? Fair enough, I hope.
Fair enough.
So what are the paranormal explanatory options? Well, the first is the one I think Marty and a lot of people favor. It's the retrocausal explanation. It's the traditional view. And if we wanted to define it, a theoretically cautious and austere definition would be this. A precognitive experience. Let's see, I've got this thing on the right of my screen I'd like to get rid of so I can read my own slides. Do you know how to do that, Marty?
Is it a Zoom thing?
I guess so, yes.
If it's a Zoom thing, just sort of click on it. You should get a move thing, and you can move it anywhere you want.
Got it.
Mine. Yeah, just
got it. Thank you.
Okay, good.
We're good. So definition of a retrocausal view would be a precognitive experience, E, at some time t, is the effect of some later event, E prime. So for example, the retrocausalists would say that it's the later plane crash that causes the earlier precognition. Okay, that's the retrocausal position. But there's a clockwise approach which we can adopt. And this is not something I came up with, Marty. This is something that's been around for a while, but it's what Jewel Eisenbud called the active analysis. And it has 2 parts. according to which precognition could be explained by some combination of these two things, and I'll explain each of them. The first is psi-mediated inference, and the second is a combination or alternation of PK and telepathic influence. Those two things, PK and telepathic influence, are actually very hard to distinguish. So what's psi-mediated inference all about? The idea there is that the earlier precognitive event results from conscious or unconscious and maybe imagery-rich future projections or inferences based on real-time psychic scanning. Let me explain what that's all about. And let me do it by means of an analogy, a normal, non-paranormal analogy. Imagine that an engineer is examining a building under construction. Looks at the blueprints, he looks at the materials, he talks with the people working on the building, and he predicts this building will collapse. So what's going on there? First of all, the engineer's statement is not a universal, unconditional statement. It's actually a tacit, conditional, or hypothetical statement. The engineer isn't claiming that the structure will collapse no matter what. Actually, the claim is of the form, the building will collapse unless, and then fill in the blank. So you could fill in the blank in any number of ways. You could say unless the design is modified, or unless different materials are used, or unless a different foreman is on the job, something like that. Secondly, the engineer bases that prediction on contemporaneous information, real-time information. So the hypothetical assertion, the building will collapse, is justified with respect to, or you might say inductively inferred from, presently available information regarding the blueprints, such as the state of the building or the materials being used to build it. Now notice, the engineer could have reached this conclusion after going home, taking a nap, and dreaming about the building collapsing. In other words, realizing then the implications of what he'd perceived earlier and what he'd processed subconsciously. That would be a little bit like what happens in a lot of apparent precognition cases, where the precognition, or the ostensible precognition, pops up in consciousness in a dream. So appealing to psi-mediated inference goes along a similar line. The precognizer's judgment that the plane will crash is a tacit conditional. The plane will crash unless fill in the blank. For example, unless repairs are made, or unless the plane takes a different flight path, or unless a different air traffic controller is on the job, something like that. And there are several virtues to this way of looking at things. But notice that this judgment is based on real-time contemporaneous information gained via real-time ESP, that is ESP of the relevant states of affairs, like the mental state of the pilot, or the air traffic controller, or the projected flight path, or the condition of the plane's engines or electrical system.
Okay, but just to be absolutely clear,
Sure.
you sort of said like it's dream precognition. In this case, the only information that might go into the dream under this assumption is real-time existing information at the time of the dream.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's, in that respect, it's analogous to what the engineer does. The engineer is basing the prediction that the building will collapse based on what he's just observed about the state of the building, the condition of the blueprints, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, right.
Okay. So the main difference, apart from the use of psi, between the precognitive case and the case of the engineer is that in the precognitive case, neither the precognizer nor anyone else will usually know how to fill in the blank in the conditional. Event E will occur unless fill in the blank. And as I said, neither the inference nor the information on which the inference is based have to be conscious. So it all may occur subconsciously as part of the precognizer's ongoing need-determined psi scanning. And it can manifest not as first-person reports of precognitive experiences, but as maybe things like lame avoidance behavior. That is, the person who is about to board the plane might say, whoops, I forgot to take the goldfish out of the oven, or something equally lame. Or it could just be a change of mood or a disabling migraine that prevents getting on the plane subconsciously inferred to crash. So you often hear reports of people who were going to be in the buildings that collapsed during 9/11 attack, but found something else to do instead, or found some reason to go, or some reason not to go. I hope that's clear. Now, here's a really interesting virtue of appealing to psi-mediated inference. This explanatory strategy avoids the famous intervention paradox. You know what that is? This plagues the retrocausal analysis, and it arises when we say that an accurate precognition of a later event like a plane crash allowed us to prevent that plane crash from occurring. If the precognition was accurate, we really precognized the plane crash, how could the event in that case not have occurred? How could we prevent it? That's the intervention paradox. The appeal to psi-mediated inference gets around that because the precognition, the precognitive inference, is an inference, and it's not an unconditional inference. It's always a conditional or hypothetical inference. Now, there are limitations to the appeal to psi-mediated inference. This will not work for cases where precognitive targets are selected after the precognition by random processes. So this rules out a lot of experimental data in precognition, because in those cases where the precognitive targets are selected after the ostensible precognition, the future states are presumably non-inferable in principle. But the active analysis has another card to play. In that case, we can opt for a second type of active analysis, and that's the appeal to a combination of PK or telepathic inference. So let me talk about that. The idea here is that the precognizer brings about the state of affairs apparently precognized. So, for example, that the precognizer of the plane crash actually affects or disposes future events in such a way that the crash occurs, or will occur unless appropriate countervailing measures are taken. So how would this work? So consider, for a plane crash, the paranormal influence could be on the plane's engines or fuel lines, or on some relevant person's mental states, like the mental state of the flight attendant, who could be influenced to do something irrational and dangerous, or similarly for a pilot or a mechanic. Or for a mine collapse, like in the Aberfan mine disaster, it could be on a crucial strut or other point of support, or on some relevant person's mental states, like those of the mine worker building the cave supports. Now, there are issues with the appeal to PK or telepathic influence. But first, the sip. Because this view suggests an extreme degree and prevalence of psychically mediated malevolence, the appeal to PK or telepathic influence encourages us to take very seriously the underlying psychodynamics in virtue of which one or more precognizers might probably unconsciously want to bring about the tragic events in question. So this theory, in other words, suggests that precognizers would actually, in some sense, want to bring about a plane crash or want to bring about a mine collapse. And predictably, there's a usual counter-argument. I think it's very weak, but the counter-argument is because people often precognize disasters like plane crashes or mine collapse, humans are simply not evil enough to cause these things intentionally. And I think there's a proper response to that weak argument, that it's unacceptably naive. Of course humans are evil enough. There's a really great quote from Jewel Eisenbud about this, so let's take a look at that. Eisenbud wrote in his book Paranormal Foreknowledge, "There is no disaster of whatever magnitude of degree or horror that has ever been foreshadowed in dream, premonition or Delphic utterance that cannot be matched in effect by one that has been brought about by some individual deliberately and with full awareness of the consequences. The record on this score is so extensive and so clear, from fatal child abuse to Hiroshima, from capriciously started wars to shocking acts of political terrorism, that there can be no reasonable argument about human propensities in this domain. The only question is whether there is a hidden part of the average, well-acculturated human being who cannot consciously imagine himself battering a child or bombing a school building that is subject to the same impulses that actuate persons who are openly destructive. And I think if we're really being honest with ourselves, we have to admit that every person has nasty thoughts under the surface. We might like to try to control them. We might like to think we're actually nice people, but that doesn't mean we never have evil thoughts. And I think once we allow the subconscious into the equation, there are no saints. So how might this actually work in a real case? Notice that in normal everyday life, we often use symbolic surrogates when we're expressing hostilities. So rather than expressing anger at one's spouse, we might take it out on a coworker or a store cashier. So a precognizer might cause a plane to crash as a way of deflecting anger from its real target. And this has the advantage of allowing the precognizer to avoid responsibility by saying or thinking, well, I didn't know anyone on the plane. I couldn't possibly have caused that. There's another issue that often comes up when this possibility of PK or telepathic influence is raised. And the question is the degree of psi we're positing here too great to be believable? And can psi really cause a plane to crash or a mine to collapse? I think there are several relevant issues we need to look carefully at. The first is we simply don't have a credible objective scale of psychic impressiveness. If you think about the evidence for materialization, for example, there's evidence for really unimpressive objects like just a finger being materialized. But there's also evidence for human figures, full human figures being materialized. And as the physiologist Charles Richet said a long time ago, it's as impressive to materialize a single finger as the entire body to which it belongs. We have no idea how either one of those things can happen. And in general, we don't have any sensible, defensible scale of psychic impressiveness. Another issue that comes up here is that large effects may have small causes. So a plane crash doesn't have to result from a huge psychic or psychokinetic outburst. It could result from a small rupture in the plane's fuel line. And the fact is, we have coercive evidence for PK, which I've presented to you folks on several occasions, of much greater magnitude than causing a small rupture in a fuel line. So I would say that the degree of psi posited by this form of the active analysis cannot be ruled out on the grounds that it's just of implausible magnitude. I think we might even say something similar when we're talking about large-scale cases where psi-mediated inference seems to be our active option, like the case of precognizing silver futures. Because here, too, we don't have a credible objective scale of psychic impressiveness. I mean, you have to consider, why is scanning many investors' mental states more difficult than one investor's mental states? Notice, when we try to say something like that, we're appealing to our ordinary concept of obscure information. But our ordinary concept of obscure information applies only to normal forms of acquiring information. We say that information is obscure when it's behind physical barriers, or when it's at a great distance, or when we have no electronic access to it, things like that. But we don't know whether what's normally obscure or difficult needs to be psychically obscure or difficult. And in fact, we seem to be able to do things psychically that we can't do normally. So I'd say we have a prima facie reason for saying that what is normally obscure or difficult need not be psychically obscure or difficult. So we can't just glibly say that precognizing silver futures posits an incredible degree of ESP. We could also say that large effects may have small causes. I mean, the person who's predicting a change in silver futures might have simply psychically noticed a market trend that escaped the notice of the usual so-called experts. Or the precognizer might have tapped into the telepathically to one person's mental states, like the Fed chairman's intended action that'll affect the market. I'll just add, and this is not, although I'm sure it sounds like a sleazy plug, for reasons I've discussed in my book, The Gold Leaf Lady, large-scale synchronicities make most sense when they're interpreted as forms of PK. PK really massively influencing the way future events roll out. So why not here as well? Again, we don't know the limits of psi, and I think we need to be very humble about that. Now, I want to tighten your belts, folks, because I want to get even more thoroughly philosophical than we've been. There are also some issues with retrocausation. I've gone into this in much greater detail than I'm going to go into it with you in my book, The Limits of Influence. And this is just a teaser, I suppose. There are two areas of concern I want to survey. The first is the careless or confused handling of the concept of causation. Most of the people who talk about backwards causation really don't know the philosophical literature. And physicists are among them. Physicists talk about causation, and they really don't know what they're talking about. They don't realize to what extent their discipline rests on a variety of philosophical concepts and assumptions. And that's material they don't know very well at all. But people usually genuflect in the presence of physicists, and I hope to wean some of you of that tendency. So I'll talk in a moment about what causation is all about. And the other thing I want to discuss is the mirror image view of retrocausation. This is something, the idea is that retrocausation is no different from clockwise causation, except for the direction of the causal arrow. And this is a view that a lot of physicists like to promote because they say that the equations of physics are time reversal invariant. That is, they work in both temporal directions. And physicists naively think they can generalize from that or extrapolate from that and talk about causation. That's the problem. So let me explain why I think it's a problem. When we posit causal connections, when we link events as cause and effect, what we're doing is explaining. We're explaining why the effect occurred. But the activity of explaining is irreducibly pragmatic. That is, it's something that has to be relativized to a context of explanation. And it's appropriate only relative to a surrounding context of inquiry. It's a little bit like giving directions. So consider how we might answer the question, how do I get to the party? There are all sorts of answers that we could give depending on whom we're speaking to and how much that person knows. We could say, well, it's at Mary's house. Or we could say, if you don't know Mary, go 2 blocks north, take a right, it's the 3rd house on the left. There are certain things we couldn't say. I mean, unless you're a mole, I couldn't say, well, just burrow in this direction. So we always have to tailor our giving of directions to the context in which the request for directions is made. And similarly, we give causal explanations in connection with the context in response to a request for explanations. It goes like this. When we identify 2 events, cause and effect, and relate the 2 causally, we're not identifying 2 discrete events or a single causal chain, C arrow E, that can be completely isolated from its surrounding history. Notice, both the cause and the effect have their own individual causal histories running from earlier to later. So in other words, each of those events, C and E, is the outcome of an enormous number of converging causal lines. Now, we never identify all those lines when we consider what caused the effect. We identify only those relevant to a context of inquiry. Let me give you an example. Suppose I have heartburn, and we want to explain, why does Braude have heartburn? What caused his heartburn? Depending on the level of analysis we want to appeal to here, we could just say, well, Braude had Mexican food for dinner. Or if I'm explaining it, I could say, well, I had Mexican food for dinner. But if we were at a meeting of the American Chemical Society and we wanted to explain why I have heartburn, we could be appealing to the chemical structure of the ingredients in my dinner. Or if at a meeting of physiologists, we could talk about the physiological disposition of my body or of my stomach in particular. Or if we're at a psychology conference, we could explain how my relationship with my parents contributed to my developing a nervous or weak stomach. Or how the chef's preoccupation with his divorce led to a carelessly liberal use of hot spices. Or if we're anthropologists, we could appeal to the cultural tradition and geographical factors that culminated in a Mexican propensity for preparing picante dishes. That's a mouthful. So all of those would count as legitimate causal explanations of my heartburn. No one of them is inherently preferred or privileged over the others. So there's a moral to this. And the moral is, whenever we relate two events as cause and effect, we inevitably presuppose that there's a surrounding network of events leading both to and away from those events. So any causal connection we identify will always be part of a larger causal nexus, and that causal nexus spreads indefinitely into the past and into the future. So the particular causal connections we find worthwhile to single out, those we identify on pragmatic grounds, depending on context, out of an intrinsically seamless web of happening, running from earlier to later and leading both to and away from the events we relate causally. So the way I look at this is that when you look at nature without trying to explain anything, it's not inherently divided up one way or another. We choose how to divide it up. We choose how to relate one part of it to another. That's what explanation is all about. So when we identify a causal connection and when we presuppose its surrounding causal history, we don't have to have in mind some specific story or a set of stories to tell about the events. Rather, we presuppose simply that there is more we could say if we had to. This is a fundamental feature of the framing of causal explanations. We could always say more. We could always go further into the past and explain what led to the events that led to my heartburn, for example, or what happened after my heartburn. This is also a fundamental feature of the concept of an event. Events are not items in a perspective-independent warehouse of ontological furniture. The pie of history can be sliced in an indefinitely number of ways. I mean, suppose I said to you, I showed you a pie that hadn't been cut up. I said, how many slices are in this pie? You should be flummoxed by that question. You should know how to answer that. There is no answer to that question. There is no privileged way of slicing the pie. Or suppose I said to you, how many events are there in World War II? Again, you shouldn't have any idea how to answer that. You could answer it in terms of particular campaigns or in much smaller scale events. Or suppose I said to you, how many objects are in this room? How many things are in this room? Again, you shouldn't know how to answer that. There's no inherently privileged inventory of things or events. But what this means is that ordinary clockwise causal connections have to be parsed on pragmatic grounds in a context out of an intrinsically undifferentiated web of happening running in the same temporal direction. In other words, each causal connection is both merely and necessarily a part of a more temporally extended clockwise causal story. Let me give you an example. When we identify the causal chain C arrow E, we presuppose that there's a larger story we could tell if we needed to, a story leading up to C from many directions and away from E in many directions. So my Mexican dinner date might be explained as a result of complex negotiations with friends. And my heartburn may lead to an argument with the waiter, or a curtailed evening with my friends, and a pathetically lonely time watching TV and chewing Tums. But when parapsychologists, philosophers, or physicists posit retrocausal chains, where the cause is later than the effect, those connections are not mirror images of clockwise causal chains. That is, the retrocausal chain is treated as isolated from a presumed surrounding web of retrocausal happening. That is, as if it has no retrocausal antecedents stretching indefinitely into the future, and no retrocausal consequences extending indefinitely into the past. So we're not told, for example, what events retrocausally led to the earlier plane crash, or what retrocausal consequences flowed backwards from the precognitive experience. And in fact, the events described in allegedly retrocausal chains, like plane crashes and dreaming, are even described using clockwise causal terms. Plane crashes and dreams are sequences of events running from earlier to later. So I would say that retrocausalists, at the very least, must defend the view of causality that they're tacitly endorsing. They have to explain why an isolated link deserves to be considered a causal link of any kind, never mind its temporal direction. No other kind of apparent or putative causal connection lacks an extensive surrounding causal history running temporally in the same direction. In fact, that's why we often need to backtrack through an event's causal history just to speculate responsibly about what that event's causal consequences might be. Let me give you an example from the philosopher Daniel Hausmann. This is his quote. Bursting of the pipe may have different consequences when it has different causes. The engineers may do some backtracking and reason. If the pipe were to burst, then either it was faulty, or a girder fell on it, or there was an earthquake, or there was sabotage, or the pressure became too great. The consequences of the bursting vary depending on which of these holds. If the pipe burst because the pressure was too great, and the pressure was too great because the reactor was going out of control, then the consequences of the pipe bursting may be different than if it were caused by corrosion, or a faulty weld, or a terrorist bomb. In order to consider how the world would differ in the future in consequence of the bursting, the engineers must also think about how the world must have differed in order for the bursting to have occurred. So retrocausalists might object to this. They might say, well, when we're talking about retrocausal connections, we're just introducing a new sense of cause, appropriate to the unique way in which later events can cause earlier events. I have a problem with that. First of all, no data require positing retrocausation. Outside of the parapsychological cases, all the proposed examples of retrocausation are highly contrived philosophical thought experiments, and you wouldn't believe how bad the literature on that is, or controversial suggestions concerning the interpretation of physical equations, things about which physicists themselves debate. Also, the parapsychological cases can all be accommodated by means of the active analysis, which appeals only to extensions of psi phenomena for which we already have evidence. Also, concepts like events and causal links are not isolated individuals. The concept of causation is part of a larger network of concepts. including explanation, understanding, event, decision, action, intention. And that's why retrocausalists can't be content with mere terminological or conceptual patchwork. They can't say, well, we're just going to revise the concept of causation here. We're going to amend or extend the concept of causation. You can't do that without repercussions elsewhere in the network of connected concepts. So people who want to say retrocausal links can be isolated, they'd no longer be endorsing the apparently simple view that the retrocausal arrow is just like the regular causal arrow except for its temporal direction. They would have to defend a sweeping and fundamental revision of our conceptual framework. And that's a revision that's neither required by the data nor obviously more parsimonious or simple than its alternatives. So what should retrocausalists say in response? I claim that it's the responsibility of retrocausalists to show why an isolated link should be considered a causal link, or why we should accept a major and apparently unnecessary revision of our conceptual framework. And I'd add to that, if retrocausal connections are not isolated, and if, like conventional causal connections, they can be parsed out of a web of happening running in the same counterclockwise direction, one would think that retrocausalists could at least make some reasonable proposals about what a surrounding retrocausal history might look like. That is, just as we could tell different conventional clockwise causal stories for ordinary events, one would expect the retrocausalists to be able to suggest possible retrohistories in which the objects and events involved in precognitions play a part, or at the very least some concrete strategies for formulating those retrohistories. But we haven't a clue how to do that. And I'd say this ignorance isn't simply due to a lack of effort or creativity, and that the retrocausalist who makes that above argument is offering a worthless promissory note. They would have to notice that to give a retrohistory, you can't talk about dreams and plane crashes. You're going to have to find ways of describing events in ways that don't presuppose clockwise causality. Because as I said earlier, plane crashes and dreams run from earlier to later. So we need a whole different set of terms. And I'd say no one's come even close to coming up with anything that looks like a plausible retrohistory, much less the retro language. Now, I probably overwhelmed you philosophically, and that's why I made my slide so explicit. But I want to stop here to prevent philosophical fatigue. There's a lot more on this topic in my book, The Limits of Influence. So now we come to the sleazy promotional part of the program. This is the book in question. I have a whole chapter on precognition with retrocausation where I go into all these details much more thoroughly. And as long as we're promoting my books, there's The Gold Leaf Lady, Immortal Remains. Marty already did this, so I'll speed through it. Crimes of Reason, First Person Plural. If you want to check me out more thoroughly, you can look at my website, jazzphilosopher.com. I have as I've said many times, a university website, but you'd never remember the URL unless you're a URL savant. So I turn it back to you, Marty.
Okay, Steve, thank you very much. Very interesting. I now understand what you're saying. The active analysis portion, which only can use psi based on existing information, has...
The psi-mediated inference part will use existing information.
Yeah, well, both parts of what you talked about did, right?
Well, I guess so. The PK telepathic influence, sure.
Yeah, okay. That's only based on what exists now.
Right.
The problem, I think, from where I'm sitting here, and I guess I will call myself a retrocausalist.
You are.
But not in the sense that you defined it. I want to define it much broader than that. First of all, I want to talk about the airplane. The problem with your airplane example is there's no way, I think, even in principle, to begin to know who caused it. Philosophically, I understand your argument that it could happen. It could even be a collection of people for some reason,
Sure.
but you're never going to be able to identify it. It's not like someone set out to cause that plane to crash consciously.
Well,
Just as
that's a problem with PK generally, Marty. I mean, we can't do a controlled PK experiment for the same reason.
well, we just did them at our conference, and people did PK, and it was clear to each of them that they were controlling the movement of the aluminum on the thing themselves. But philosophically, let's just say there are cases, and when people bend a spoon, and Dean Radin did this and wrote about it, it was clear in his mind that he was the active participant there.
Well, he was a contributor to it at the very least, and that's why I've always advocated studying large-scale PK.
Okay, well, you have to understand, I'm not even disagreeing with you, but it seems very limited, especially in the example, as you touched on, where there's a prediction and then some random-like events come into play. And someone like Joe McMonagle, and we've seen, and I'm sure you've seen, so many examples where he was just dead on, that the simpler explanation is that he did get the information from the future in that instance, and made a wonderful comparison. And most of us at one time or another have done that. Now, I agree with, and in fact, I am totally supporting and saying more and more that even when you look at that one instance, that instance of the feedback when he saw the actual target and then somehow entangled. So I use the word entanglement rather than cause and effect, because the feedback is entangled with the remote viewing session, but it is also entangled with what happens further in the future. And the explanation for someone like Joe and a lot of others of us who get better and better is that in the future we're learning more and more, and that's also coming to bear in the existing example that we're doing. In other words, yes, the later feedbacks are helping the earlier ones, but all of that is in the chain of the future, just like you said in the past. The history of World War II can't really be broken down into individual parts, but a lot of things that happened before are part of its explanation. The same thing about retrocausality. There are things which happen after a specific event that indeed have affected that. And it just seems to me, and again, it's not like I can disagree with your arguments because you couch them in such general terms. You can't prove it one way or another. However, the perspective of general retrocausality and the entanglement argument just seems so much simpler. Plus, it allows us to go forward with individual people taking responsibility for the specific events.
I would challenge the claim that it's a simpler explanation, because appeals to simplicity are actually very tricky. There's no, usually when we talk about simplicity in science or logic, one kind of simplicity involves another kind of complexity. And that's always the price we pay. So in logic, it's particularly clear. If you have a logical system with a lot of primitive terms, you get simple formulas and proofs. But if you go down to one basic logical primitive, you have very long formulas and very complex proofs. And the same thing is true in science.
Well, but in addition to simplicity, okay, comment on the fact that Joe McMonagle, for example, would certainly feel that he's responsible for his earlier transcripts, and he got the information from the future. And we know when he was learning early on, I don't think he would object to saying that his future self was indeed assisting him in getting better and better. But it's more personal than the way you put it. I mean, in the way you put it, Joe McMonagle could have gotten a good example because somebody else was affecting I guess everything that happened, the target that they came up just happened to match his transcript.
I'm not following everything you're saying here, but first of all, I would caution you against supposing that Joe McMoneagle, I grant you that precognition or precognitive experiences seem as if the information is coming from the future. That's the way it
Entangled.
appears.
I would use the word entangled, that the two are intimately entangled together. It's as if the information were out there all the time, and some people can get a hold of it, earlier.
Yes, it's as if, as if. And I would say that the fact that somebody's good at doing ESP or precognitions is no more guarantee of their theoretical understanding than somebody who's a skilled pianist would know how to teach somebody to play the piano.
Okay. Well, as I say, I think I understood your argument well enough to know you can't refute it. You can't prove it, just like the retrocausality argument is hard to prove, except there's evidence that both of us would have to explain where the matches are just extraordinarily good over and over and over and over again. And I think the idea is to come up with a model which would allow more and more people to do better and better at precognition / retrocausality. And I just think the retrocausal argument, the entanglement argument that the information is out there, is one which allows people to move forward, I don't know, more aggressively or whatever. But as I say, I can't, and I wouldn't want to in any way take away the argument. The argument seems philosophically and intellectually hangs together, but it's certainly not one that I would want to encourage precoggers to get into because I want them to take responsibility.
It takes responsibility. It takes away the responsibility for the events in question. But you're still faced with the intervention paradox. You're still faced with the revisions to our conceptual framework, which are otherwise not mandated even remotely.
Let me take on, because, and this is new in my thinking, the interference paradox. See, I believe that out there, I call it the universe of collective consciousness, other people call it the matrix, are not only things which actually happen, but all the probable things which can happen are also out there. Now, it got to be really clear that I say also, but the one that actually happens is marked special. But if I go and tell somebody that a store is going to be robbed, and I tell the police and I sound credible enough that they stop it, I got the information because that was a most probable event, unless I were to go to the police and they were indeed to stop it. So there's most probable information out there as well as the information about the actual events.
Well, that's the beauty of metaphysics.
Yes. But it gives me the ability to say that, and in fact, that's an explanation for it.
Yes.
Let's open it up for other people. You and I could go on for a very long time. Please, anybody else? Let me check the chat box, put things in either the chat box or open up your own mic.
Hey, Marty, this is Derek.
Hi, Derek.
It seems that the notion of free will should be included in this conversation.
Well, go ahead, say more. What's your perception on that?
Well, I mean, yes, everything from the past, who knows how far back, contributes to making a decision, but I think a lot of us would like to feel like we can make decisions based on the information that we have, and therefore have responsibility for those decisions independent of our analysis of prior events. And so if we don't have free will, then that in my mind is a problem. And I think that it may or may not be a problem from the standpoint of retrocausality.
I would have said it's more of a problem from the standpoint of retrocausality, because depending on how you're envisioning the way the world is put together for that to work, you might say the future is already fixed, so there's nothing we can do about it.
And I would say it's less of a problem, because the most important part about time is this very moment. This is only where you have free choice, is in the now. This is where you make your free choice. And not only does the past influence that, but precognition shows the future influence. And
That's where the problem of free will comes in.
No, it's in this very moment that you have free will. You are, just like you can't use the past to say, he was raised by terrible parents and he did this and that. And in this very moment, all those things participated, but he still was a person of free will. He could have chosen to do something else. And I think free will, and at least in my model, and I think in most people's models, you just know that there is free will because you experience it in yourself in the now. And now if a guy had a gun to your head and is telling you what to do in terms of physical stuff, you don't have free will, but you still have free will in thinking, what can I do to get out of this situation? Free will is in the now, and every single one of us has it, in my opinion. But part of it is definition. I don't see how you could possibly imagine you do not have free will in the now.
There's a vast literature on this. We can't go into the whole topic of free will.
And so much of it is definition.
But you realize that physicists, many of them would say we live in a block universe, right?
Yeah, even Einstein said that. And I disagree with that. The universe is so wonderful that we have free will, and yet there's a future out there, but there's uncertainty. The uncertainty principle is part of all this too. And our intellect is not anywhere close to, quote, understanding it, which is something you said, and that's true. No matter which philosophical perspective you want to take, we know we do not understand it all. In fact, we understand very little of all this.
Well, I certainly agree with that.
So we didn't give you an answer about free will, Derek, but it comes up over and over again. And I think, your consciousness is personal to you. And I believe if you just take a look at your consciousness, in now moments, you're a person of free will. You can raise your right hand now or your left hand now. And that doesn't mean there aren't influences. That's why I love the title of Steve's book, The Limit of Influences. Okay, any other questions? Interesting point here. Billiard ball model, karmic consideration. Yes, because, all of this is playing out at a much higher level than just the physical world. But even that's an assumption, I suppose. But John K., good to see the description of some issues with the retrocausality. Please give an example of active analysis that you find convincing. Okay, well, John K. asked that question. Can you see the chat box? Well, I don't mind reading them. But he just said, could you give an example of active analysis, where that explanation would be really compelling, that you find convincing?
Well, it could be the Aberfan mine disaster. It could be the sinking of the Titanic. There are good discussions of both of those cases in Jewel Eisenbud's book, Paranormal Foreknowledge.
Well, yeah, but why would an active... See, the active is always it's a perspective, isn't it? It's a perspective that you want to take on how events come about.
Well, we know that some people are really first-rate ESP virtuosi.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, what distinguishes them from ordinary folk? Is it just that they can manifest their ESP panache consistently and overtly? Might the rest of us be able to do it subconsciously when we're not inhibiting our psychic selves? I mean, so when people seem to know what's going to happen in the future, we can't suppose that the degree of ESP required for predicting the future event is anything more spectacular than what our well-known virtuosi do regularly.
No, and as I say, theoretically, I understand what you're saying now. I mean, Nostradamus, let's just assume one of his predictions for 1,000 years in the future, or the Bible, people will point out things there. So again, time doesn't matter, you would say. They could be doing it based on the information they had 1,000 years earlier. But it just seems to me it's easier to understand, and it encourages those of us who are interested in precognition and retrocausality to take the point of view that the information is somehow out there, and we're acting more like witnesses to it. And
But the information is out there for the psi-mediated inference case. It's just all contemporaneous.
Well, the contemporaneous information about what's happening 1,000 years from now, there's not a lot of it out there.
Well, I wouldn't pin any hopes on the case of Nostradamus. I mean,
okay, but there are other examples where people have made predictions many years in advance. Okay, I don't want us to go around in circles. Someone here up, UP, I guess, said, yeah, quantum mechanics is totally reversible in terms of its equations, but the problem is, how do we get to skip between these different points in time? And they're just different perspectives on that, I guess. Right. Gathering information from different points in time. Yeah, I mean, okay, Anastasia, thank you for an interesting presentation. I've not read your books. Did you study, presumably, the best in ESP in human history? The saints, yeah, he studies the saints a lot. I am not suggesting for us to be like saints, but maybe studying their lives a little may help us to be better remote viewers and remote influencers a little better. My apologies for such a presumptuous opinion. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I don't disagree with that. It might make us better persons, but it doesn't mean that we're going to free ourselves from all the nastiness of our subconscious.
Yeah. No, but Steve has spent a lot of time looking at some saints in particular. He's done talk with here, and I think at some of our workshops as well. But it's a little bit like savants. We know that these people have these capabilities, but I'm not sure we can identify why. Okay,
no, we don't know. We certainly don't understand savants or prodigies or a lot of things about human capacities. We don't even understand what human abilities are, for that matter.
Yeah. We don't even understand what understanding is.
Well, indeed. Indeed.
When we get down to that point, right? Okay, you can be making decisions outside of time in the karmic model. This applies to the Judeo-Christian theory of mind, as well as your decisions are not time dependent, but outcome dependent.
I don't understand making decisions outside of time. Making decisions takes time.
Yeah, in the physical world, the conscious physical world, you only get to make decisions in the now. When you leave the physical world and you're a soul, I have the slightest idea. But yes, I would imagine in that world, and I think that's what you mean by karmic model. When you're in some soul-like state where time is just, you're like outside of space and time, and I actually agree with the fact that you're still in a learning mode, but you're viewing things so differently that I suppose just the decisions on where to look and stuff like that might very well be outside of time.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I don't understand that. If things occur one after the other, that happens in time.
That's physical world time.
But you're talking about making decisions outside of time. Making a decision is something that takes time.
And I agree with you. You cannot make decisions in the physical world outside time, but Up brought in a karmic model. And maybe we should have him explain it. I'm agreeing with you. I don't believe you can make decisions in the physical world outside of time. You're living in time.
Forget about the physical world. If you're making a decision, if you're having one thought after another, that can only be in time. If you're having mental processes, even independently of a physical body, supposing that makes sense. If you can have mental processes, things happen one after the other. That's what time is.
But what about this concept of outside of space and time?
That's what I'm questioning.
That there is any meaning to something like that.
Yes.
And that's because you're in the physical world. People have these karmic type. You, Peter, you here? Why don't you tell us? Turn off your unmute your mic. Let me see if I can do that. And why don't you tell us what you meant by the karmic model? You know, we've all heard that, but in the concept of time, it'd be very interesting to get your perspective on that. I cannot unmute you, apparently. Can you unmute yourself? Or maybe just type something in the chat box. I noticed Derek talked about the idea that you choose to be born to certain specific parents as opposed to the random nature of sperm and ovaries coming together, and that there's a certain idea that that can happen outside of space and time. And then you choose to come into the physical world. I mean, there are ideas like that out there.
Yes, and the question is whether they're coherent. If there's change, there's time. If you have a thought at one moment and then another thought, it can only be at a different moment.
There is bringing into the physical world from apparently nothing. Quantum mechanics has that concept. Electrons go through the zero-point energy field and they look like they come from nothing. And that might be this outside of space and time. Okay, wait, let's see. Here's Up answers. Okay. That is only if your mental processes are fundamentally physical chemical. Most philosophies place the mind outside of the physical before the concept of physical matter was ever understood. It can be understood that the mind is fundamental. If we are to allow psi, this is acceptable. See, he's getting to the whole idea that consciousness is fundamental, which of course is something I talk about all the time as well. And other philosophers have talked about that as well.
Even if you say that, it doesn't get you outside of time.
Not when I say it in the physical world. But if there's a non-physical place.
If there's change, if there's one thought and then there's another thought and then there's another thought, there's time.
Well, what if all the thoughts in some fashion are already coherently put together? The thought of red, I'm sort of making this up as I go along, but the thought of red, not a red fire engine, but the thought of red is out there, and it's out there separate from time and space. In other words, and so all these concepts can be out there outside of space and time, and then they get put together in some mysterious fashion and come into the physical world, and then they're linear.
I have no idea what that means. Look, if you have one thought, if you make a decision, if at one point you didn't make a decision, and then you make a decision, then you have another thought about that. It's one thought after another. I don't see anything that you said that indicates why it's wrong to say that if there's change, there's time.
There isn't
I'm
anything.
not talking about physical. I'm not talking about the physical. If idealists are right in that it's all mental, there's still time because there's change.
In the see, we don't know anything, and then I think we have to stop because, it gets to the point, there's no convincing going on here. It's a perspective. But there's a perspective that, hey, when you die, there's something that is coherent that remains with you. You have something like a personal soul. Now, what is that? That's an assumption. But that soul now is living in a very different kind of space.
But not timeless.
Well, you don't know that. I don't know that.
If there's change, you're positing change. You're positing things that happen.
I'm positing that I don't know what happens after I die. I think that's done on purpose, so I get to enjoy moment-to-moment physical worlds. But when I die, I don't know what goes on, but I believe it is certainly possible that I have access to information all at once. I have information where a sense of outside of time makes sense. It's almost like if you lived in Flatland, and I'm sure you've read that book.
Right.
You know about the book. So if you live in a flatland, but now I move into a third dimension, I am seeing all of flatland at once. And that's a perspective which a flatlander couldn't possibly understand.
But
and
it's not timeless.
And I think the same thing could be true of time. That's the perspective.
I don't know what to say except to say what I've said before.
Right.
I mean, look, you're sympathetic to the idea of post-mortem survival of some sort because, for example, that there are good apparent instances of communication with the departed from cases of mediumship, right? If that's happening, the communicating entities are transmitting thoughts. They're interacting with mediums. That's something that takes time.
Absolutely.
The communicator, well, but then there's mental change. As long as there is mental change, as long as there is one thought following another thought, leading to other thoughts, there's change. That means there's time.
Seances occur in the physical world. So that soul has somehow managed to come from a place outside of space and time. A three-dimensioner put his finger into the two-dimensional world. And these seances, the person who is coming from someplace else has managed to do that. That's rather remarkable, actually. Okay, here's John K. In some versions of the block universe, so this is a question to you, isn't it the case that everything is there? There is no time?
Well, there's still before and after.
One thought form, and then can you not say that the latter receives a form? Okay, well, in other words, the tag of time is still there in the block universe.
Yes, yes.
And I think that is. That's how I understand it, too. John, do you have something else in mind there?
There's also subjective time even in the block universe. The question is whether those two things are compatible.
Okay, and here's UP. This is an important philosophical discussion regardless. Read Time's Arrow and Archimedes' Point for more info if desired, tangential to our own conversations on psi. Okay, Steve, always so interesting. There's always so many different ways to view the reality each of us experiences.
Well, fortunately, I didn't pin anything on convincing you.
Well, I don't think you wanted to. I think you wanted to put out, and I had not heard well enough so that I understood it. So this is a first for me, and I thank you for that. And I think for a lot of other people, the approach that you discussed here, which is in fact a very different approach to precognition. I would certainly not put it out as an approach that I would further in terms of the point of view, because I don't think it's helpful for newbies or people who want to further their own personal precognitive capabilities. But that doesn't mean that it isn't a way of looking at precognition. I accept that.
Well, then I'm happy.
Okay, good. Okay, well, with that, let's I think we can end this. And again, I thank you just very much for sharing all of that with us.
I thank you, Marty. It's always good to have a chance to put this stuff out there.
Yeah, okay. So everybody take care and keep precogging no matter what your philosophy. Bye now.
Bye-bye.